and your lunch. So I will try to keep my introductory comments very brief, and then we'll proceed to introduce the speakers. We've chosen today to highlight a little data, which you see on the screen behind me, that is probably familiar to many of you, but we highlight it to represent the global nature of this problem. Homelessness is not a new problem. It has existed for a while, but it has been elevated to a pressing and urgent problem for a couple of reasons. One has to do with the expanding and escalating number of homeless people around the world, whether that homelessness is in the face of children, families, the elderly, the disabled, as well as migrants and immigrants. The estimated number of 150 million people worldwide who are homeless, here meaning sleeping in the rough or without shelters, many think is an underestimate. Certainly on my walk in today on 42nd Street, I counted several homeless people sleeping rough without shelters. But we should also take a look at the 1.6 billion people who are living in inadequate housing, and by that we mean housing that have deficient plumbing or heating or electricity. They too are in housing insecure status. It doesn't take a brain scientist or even a psychologist to understand that housing and adequate housing is essential and are essential elements for providing a safe and secure environment in which to live. And indeed, one of our psychologists, Abraham Maslow, reminded me that shelter is a physiological need. It's a fundamental need that is essential to ensure other basic needs, one of safety and security. And these basic needs must be met before we can begin to address other human needs. A second reason why this issue is important is because of all the declarations that have come from other organizations. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights reminds us that they define homelessness as a violation of a right to an adequate standard of living, including health and security. And certainly our own World Summit for Social Development, which looks at one goal of social development to enhance the quality of lives, also includes in that definition freedom from homelessness and inadequate housing. But you may ask, why do psychologists and specifically SPSSI find this to be a pressing issue? And there are three basic reasons I'll go through quickly. First, SPSSI, the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, is organized or was organized for the purpose of bringing together socially minded psychologists to address social and economic issues. SPSSI uses social psychological research to advocate for a more socially just world, and certainly the issue of homelessness and its root causes clearly speak to some of the mandates of SPSSI. Second is our research in psychology, which clearly shows us that those who are homeless are more likely to experience trauma, suicide, social isolation, and physical deprivation than are those who have adequate housing. This sudden disruption in their modes of daily living is one factor that contributes to psychological distress. And this psychological distress has been documented in research studies when looking at particularly two groups of people. One is a large number of people forced to migrate due to climate change or other natural disasters, or to man-made crises like war. And it was also evident during the global foreclosure crisis, where housing insecurity, the threats of eviction or actual eviction was linked to higher incidences of mental health among that population. And finally, studies show that homelessness, when it's rooted in poverty, is difficult to reverse. Studies have also shown that people who are homeless appear to adapt to this condition over time, making it very difficult to transition them from a homeless existence to one who can be placed in adequate housing. And psychological distress that's experienced by this population appears to be particularly more prevalent in women. Thus, homelessness has an adverse impact on health and well-being and can result in the violation of people's human rights. For those reasons and others, SPSSI and psychologists are very interested in trying to prevent the onset of homelessness. I'm now going to turn the program over to Dr. David Livert, who is our SPSSI Main Representative, who's going to introduce the speakers.
Thank you, Debbie. Good morning. On behalf of the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, I'd like to thank you for attending, both live and online. I would like to acknowledge our co-sponsors before I go on and introduce our first speaker. Our co-sponsors include the European Health Psychology Society, the NGO Committee on Mental Health, the Institute for Multicultural Counseling and Education Services, the International Association of Applied Psychology, the International Association of Gerontology and Geriatrics, and the International Council of Psychologists, and also the Psychological Coalition of NGOs accredited at the United Nations. Thank you all. Lots of people. I'd first like to introduce our first speaker, Debra Paget, who is a professor in the McSilver School of Social Work at NYU. She is an author of books on the housing first approach, textbooks on multi-method approaches in research, which is very, very important for us these days to pursue. And in fact, along those lines, she's recently received an NIMH grant in R01, yes, to conduct a qualitative study of mental health and substance abuse among the homeless. This is just in terms of an accomplishment in the social sciences. That's fantastic, because there's always been a quantitative bent, and we have to open up the door to multiple methods. In addition to that, she is going to talk a little bit about her recent ethnographic research with homeless in Delhi. On a personal note, I must say that it's great for you to be here, and in fact, I have been to your hometown of Paducah, Kentucky.
Oh,
in the past. So
did you recover from it?
I have recovered fully. Thank you very much. So, Dr. Deborah Padgett.
Thank you very much. Yes, it's a long way from Kentucky to New York and New Delhi and back, but it's been quite a journey. So what I'm going to speak about today is housing first from a global perspective. I'm going to start fairly broad, and then we're going to work through the speakers to taking less global and more specific and research-based presentations. But what I thought I would do is just talk a little bit about housing first, and then move on to some work I've been doing with colleagues at an NGO in Chennai. So first, a shameless plug for the book on Housing First that I co-authored with my former doctoral student Ben Hinwood and Sam Simbaris, who founded Housing First here in New York City. And in fact, there is Sam up on the screen. He was an early outreach worker, psychologist with homeless people, and he developed Housing First as a means of addressing what the homeless people were saying is, we want a home, we don't want to go to Bellevue or psychiatric wards and so forth. So Housing First, I'm going to leave to my colleague, Dr. Greenwood, to describe in much greater detail. But I just want to say that it did start here in New York City in 1992 and has since spread to many parts of this country and the Western world, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about India. The drivers of the shift to Housing First, some of them are the research evidence, which is very powerful, which you're going to hear more about, cost savings. Often a local champion will be involved, someone who really wants to see change, is willing to spearhead an effort. And the fact that we're in the 4th decade of homelessness here in the West and in New York City, it's time to try something different than just the usual way of shelters and proving your housing worthiness before you get into housing. And what we've seen, of course, is in the research is just the incredible lasting benefits for the individuals who are put into housing and given support services to stay housed. So there has been some resistance, and I just want to point to these points and say that all of these apply to the global South except the first one. The first one is the resistance to Housing First comes from what I call a homeless industry. That is, in New York City alone, we have a $3 billion a year homeless services efforts paid for by the city, by federal funds, state. But the city budget is $3 billion on homelessness, and virtually all of that goes to shelters and shelter maintenance rather than, of course there are efforts for affordable housing. But that is true of New York City. what is true of this country and the rest of the world is there is resistance from people who object to some of the values of Housing First, like harm reduction, where you don't lose your housing because you're using drugs or alcohol. Some are offended by that. Sometimes people feel that you shouldn't get something for nothing, that is, get a home when you haven't demonstrated your worthiness. And I don't want to leave out all the structural barriers, which I could spend a whole hour just talking about in terms of the loss of affordable housing in this country since the 1980s, and the lack of attention to housing for all, and particularly for very poor people, which is ultimately responsible for this crisis that we're facing of currently 60,000 homeless in New York City alone, around 650,000 a year in the U.S. So I put this in, but I'm going to skip it. I just want to say we have all these, you're in New York City, you see these gleaming high-rises. They're half empty. They have $3.7 million condos. They've been built for the wealthy and the affluent, and they're sitting half empty. So the juxtaposition for me of providing tax rebates and great incentives to private business to build these beautiful multi-million-dollar condos and then let them sit empty with the shelters overburdened with how many, 60,000 plus people, it's a little bit hard to tolerate, in my opinion. So, there's a lot of issues around zoning. We won't go into that, but the juxtaposition of gleaming high-rises, empty units, and then people living on the street is very hard to take. So, my question and the main purpose, and I hope want to move through this quickly, is can Housing First work in a global South context? And I want to talk about my experience in India, where they developed Housing First without really hearing of the model from the West, but thinking through and manifesting the values of Housing First. And we heard that 1.6 billion are in inadequate housing. About 1 billion, or 1 in 7 people in the world, are living in what are called informal settlements, or what we used to call slums. That's 1 in 7. In the global South, housing, like in the North, is commodified. That is often left to the private sector to develop and build housing. I see in India and many parts of the world, there's still this reliance on religious charities, and as if that will take care of the problem. And we know that's not to denigrate this help, but it is not sufficient to really address this charity alone. It needs to be a government issue, and for that reason, affordable housing is severely limited around the world, and especially in the global South. Here's a map just to illustrate where the concentrations are of people living in informal settlements. You can see sub-Saharan Africa has dense concentrations of people living in informal settlements, where it goes up to over 80%, and then India, where I've done my work, is very high as well. You have as many as 1 million people living in just one slum in Mumbai alone. So the extent of the problem of lack of adequate housing is one that is really hard to address without looking at structural barriers. But I want to start local now and go down, just zoom in to Chennai, India, where a very visionary person named Vandana Gopikumar started an organization called the Banyan over 20 years ago. And this was to help homeless women with serious mental illness come in off the street, rejected by their families, living on the streets and the sidewalks of Chennai, which used to be called Madras. And the Banyan has really transformed literally hundreds of people's lives. They also have a men's shelter. But what they did a few years ago is, let me go back to that one, is develop both an emergency crisis center, but also more enduring housing options for these women. So I call it Housing First, sort of spontaneous or ad hoc or improvised in Chennai. And I've been there 4 times now and worked closely with the Banyan and seen the results, and they're quite amazing. So they've taken women who are rejected by society. Psychiatric hospitals are basically jails in India. It's not a good situation at all if you have a mental illness. So what they are trying to do is form what they call inclusive living options, which I call Housing First. These living options include clustered group homes. This is actually a campus where I've taught, where they have masters in social work and psychology students studying, But on the campus, co-residing with the students are these women. So in the middle of a class, one of the women living there will come up and give me a hug, and I keep lecturing, but it's kind of wonderful to have them coming in and out of the classroom and feeling at home. And they also run a cafe on the campus. So there is cluster housing where the women live with the students and mingle with the students, run a cafe. And then, this is the true housing first, where they had donated, this is the state of Tamil Nadu, which is a little bit more generous than other Indian states, supporting the Banyan. But on their own, they developed cluster independent living. That is, they were able to rent large units, not houses in that sense, but fairly large units where they could place some of these women to live together. These are women who couldn't go back home and been rejected by their families. So what they have is called the Home Again program, and a group of 4 to 6 women will live together, and they found the transformation in these women is phenomenal. They've gone from being in hospital wards, very low affect, non-reactive, to now cooking, cleaning for themselves, going into vocational rehab courses, and the change has been amazing. And these are photos of some of the women standing in front of their residence. So this is what I call housing first, kind of in the style of Tamil Nadu or Chennai. I want to end by just saying that I'm so gratified to be here at the United Nations, because in a little over a week is going to be a human rights meeting in which Leilani Baha, who is the UN Rapporteur on the right to housing, will be presenting her document, which, unless I'm wrong, is the first time since 1948 that the UN has really come out and addressed this directly, the right to housing. It is somewhere in the Sustainable Development Goals, but you have to look very hard, and it's not up front. But this is a document, and I'll be happy to share it, where there are guidelines to the right to housing. So I'm going to end with just a few of these guidelines that will be presented so that the right to housing is brought to scale globally. Some of these are kind of the obvious things, but there are things that need to be stated, like the guarantee to the right to housing is a human right. Ensure the gradual implementation with what they call reasonableness. Under each of these, there are longer paragraphs describing what it would take under each of these guidelines for the human right to housing. Ensure meaningful participation. Include persons who are housing unstable and homeless or formerly homeless. These are stakeholders. I've heard in other sessions here these individuals tell us amazing stories and provide incredible advice that's very meaningful for enacting this policy. Eliminate homelessness as soon as possible, homelessness, and try to stop these forced evictions, which are happening every day in every way around the world. Finally, I just condensed these down for the purpose of today. To upgrade informal settlements, what we call slums or favelas, to upgrade them from the deplorable conditions that many of them show in terms of lack of access to clean water, sanitation, even in terms of stable housing and a place to access to transportation and so forth. So one of these guidelines is to use a human rights-based approach, engaging stakeholders living in formal settlements. To ensure gender equality, we know that one of the drivers of women's homelessness is domestic violence. So one of the guidelines is to ensure that women's land rights are respected. We see in India sometimes that what's on paper in terms of women's land rights is not necessarily realized in actuality. But even the legal rights of women are still contested in so many parts of the world to have their own home or to have access to housing on their own, independent of husbands or family. And then finally ensure housing for migrants and internally displaced persons. Climate change, as mentioned, is an increasingly problematic area of increasing homelessness and displacement of people from flooding and so forth. And then to ensure rights, legal rights or access to justice and legal advice of persons who are at risk of being homeless. So these are some of the guidelines. I just want to end today with implications moving forward to make some recommendations that I think NGOs can be like the Banyan, have an inspirational, tireless leader like Vandana Gopikumar is, and ensures buy-in from the government, but also they use a lot of volunteers, and they have gotten grants from Grand Challenges Canada, and their work just keeps proving itself to be effective and attracting funders. But they hope they're spreading into neighboring states in southern India. So I think NGOs can affect change in local places in the global south. I think the Housing First principles, even if they're not known or enunciated, can be used in terms of consumer empowerment, the right to housing. Do not force a person to choose housing or their lifestyle, but to give them housing as a stable, Maslow-like place where they can recover from mental illness and substance use or other life traumas. The root causes continue, which is commodified housing, private sector, governments that do not see it as their responsibility to provide housing to people who cannot afford, frankly, the costs of housing in many of our cities in the U.S. and around the world. And I would also say I would try to avoid pitting rough sleepers or people on sidewalks against people in formal settings. I've seen some of these arguments in policy discourse, that there are many ways to make a difference, and we can address rough sleeping, but we can also address improving the lot of people living in informal settlements without having to make those kind of policy choices. So these are some of the general recommendations, and I'd like to thank you for listening. So I'll stop now. So.
Thank you, Dr. Padgett. Next up, Dr. Ronnie Greenwood, who is currently a lecturer in social and community psychology at the University of Limerick. She, throughout her career, has passionately pursued topics in terms of social justice, social inclusion, and well-being. She has done quite a bit of work in publications emanating from such things as her work with the Pathways Housing First project. She is principal investigator of the Irish Housing First evaluation. She's just finishing up work with the Homelessness as Unfairness study, which was sponsored by the European Commission, which occurred in 8 countries, and she's an active consultant to program evaluation. Dr. Greenwood has her PhD in social psychology from the CUNY Graduate Center, and I am very, very proud to mention Dr. Greenwood as a very dear friend. Thank you for coming across the pond.
Thank you, Dr. Livert, for inviting me. I'm just really excited and grateful that you invited me to be part of this panel with esteemed colleagues and friends.
Lift up the mic.
Oh, can you not hear me? Okay. That's unusual that people can't hear me, so I'll keep going and try again. Thank you. So I was just saying I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted that Dr. Livert invited me to be part of this panel. I'm really honored to be able to talk to you here today about the evidence base for Housing First. It's a strategy to end chronic homelessness and promote recovery for people who have experienced long-term homelessness. I'll start my talk with some images of homelessness from around the globe and some statistics from the OECD countries. In OECD countries, homelessness accounts for about 1% of the population or less. In Canada, for example, it's less than 0.5% of the population. In the United States, it's less than 0.2% of the population. And in Ireland, for example, it's less than 0.1% of the population. So the actual number of people in the entire global population that are homeless is small, but the problem seems pretty intractable. Worldwide, significant resources are invested in reducing the incidence and prevalence of homelessness, and yet the numbers continue to increase. So today I'm going to talk about North American and European approaches to ending chronic homelessness. The people who are in chronic homelessness make up about 10% of the homeless population, but they use about 50% of system resources like hospitals and jails and prisons and emergency accommodation. So there's huge costs to society, but there's also huge costs to the people who get caught in chronic homelessness in terms of high rates of mortality, physical and mental health problems, victimization and trauma, and addictions. So the problem persists. This problem persists even though we have the solution to chronic homelessness. So I'll just say that again. We do have the solution. We do understand how to end chronic homelessness, and it's person-centered homes and supports. Now, person-centered homes and supports are an alternative to the traditional approach to homeless services, which is variously called the staircase model or the linear continuum of care. Typically, the linear continuum of care is made up of a series of steps that moves from homelessness on the streets, drop-in centers, emergency accommodation, transitional accommodation, all the way up to permanent independent accommodation, which may be offered to you if you obey all the rules and you comply with treatment and you live successfully in very difficult circumstances. So if you do all of that, you may or may not achieve permanent housing. But interestingly, research from Europe suggests it takes an individual an average of 10 years to move through that continuum. Why? Well, shelters and transitional housing are congregate, with lots of people living in different phases of addiction and mental illness and recovery, living really in close quarters, living spaces together, trying to get through this. So these congregate accommodations tend to look like this. There's rigid rules, there's strict treatment requirements, serious compromises to people's privacy, and they're often experienced as extremely unsafe places to be. So instead of a staircase, people get stuck on what Kim Hopper has called the institutional circuit. People either get kicked out of these places because they don't follow the rules, or they can't abide the living conditions, or they don't feel safe at all. People I've talked to have told me that they go back to the streets over living in congregate housing because they actually feel safer. So they go back to the streets for one reason or another, and then they may be picked up by the police for panhandling or using or having psychotic symptoms that disturb other people, and then they go back onto the institutional circuit again. So Pathways to Housing was founded in 1992 right here in New York City as a solution to circumvent the institutional circuit. Housing First offers access to permanent, independent housing integrated in the community with client-led supports and no preconditions. So it completely jumps over the intermediate steps of emergency and transitional housing. In a Housing First program, individuals receive immediate access to a private home integrated into the community with wraparound, client-led supports that empower them to pursue their own individualized recovery goals. Consumer choice is the core organizing principle that underpins the philosophy and practice of Housing First. Restoring choice, which is stripped away through the experience of homelessness, restores people's self-determination and mastery, that feeling of having control over one's own destiny. This is fundamental to wellness and recovery. From the earliest trials of Housing First, which was called the New York Housing Study, we saw that participants in Housing First programs immediately got housed and stayed housed. So as you can see, the Housing First group, which is called the experimental group on this slide, immediately increased the proportion of time they spent stably housed and then maintained their time stably housed over time. And you compare this to the control group, which shows a slow and shallow approach toward spending more time in stable housing, but they never reached that of Housing First. And you can see how that slow climb mimics that long, slow staircase that I showed to you earlier. And Housing First costs less too. So in Denver, for example, after entry into a Housing First program, so the light blue bars are after entry and the dark blue bars are before entry, and these are the costs for different kinds of services. So after entry into a Housing First program, spending decreased for detox, incarceration, emergency rooms, inpatient care, and shelter accommodation was virtually eliminated. Not only does Housing First end homelessness and cost less while doing so, but it also promotes recovery. So specifically, we found from the New York Housing Study those links in the chain that I've described to you already. So being assigned to program assignment, being in a Housing First program is associated with more choice over housing and services. And importantly, that choice over housing and services is the antecedent, or it promotes people's feelings of mastery or self-determination. And that feeling of self-determination is important to recovery outcomes. For example, fewer psychiatric symptoms. Now, 2 more North American studies are worth noting. Canada delivered the largest randomized and controlled study of Housing First so far. In this study, they found that significantly more participants in the Housing First group stayed housed all the time compared to the treatment as usual group, and they also found a significant savings. Similar findings were found with a VA HUD study. According to an article in The Hill, since 2008, more than 93 housing vouchers have been awarded to vets, and according to HUD, the number of homeless veterans has fallen from 74,000 in 2010 to about 38,000 in 2018. 93,000, Deborah Padgett says. So that's
Sorry.
Not 93. I like 93. So. Okay.
Sorry.
So Housing First jumped the pond over to Europe more than 10 years ago, and now it's in at least the following countries: Finland, Norway, Sweden, Ireland, the United Kingdom, Portugal, Spain, France, Belgium, Italy, the Netherlands, and Poland. And the list keeps growing. So in Finland, they implemented a modified version of Housing First, and new incidences of chronic homelessness all but disappeared. In 10 years between 2007 and 2017, 7,290 homeless people were housed in scattered flats, bought on the private market, rental flats from social housing, and converted housing units, additional converted housing units. So the creator of Finnish Housing First says access to an adequate supply of social housing, affordable social housing, is the most important factor in ending chronic homelessness. I led a European comparison of the experiences of individuals in Housing First programs compared to individuals in traditional homeless services in 8 of these countries. We found that people living in Housing First programs reported more choice over housing and services, and they also reported better housing quality. These in turn predicted recovery on a number of outcomes: more time in private accommodation, fewer psychiatric symptoms, more community integration, and more recovered capabilities. Now, what are capabilities? Capabilities refers to one's freedom to do what you want to do and to be and become who you want to be and become. This is an approach that was introduced to the field of development by Amartya Sen as an indicator of equality. Homelessness is a situation of extreme unfairness and inequality. And so capabilities are an important indicator of the extent to which homeless services reverse that unfairness. The finding that capabilities were higher among Housing First participants across all of our 8 countries indicates that Housing First works more effectively than traditional homeless services to reverse inequality and promote fairness for adults with long histories of homelessness and complex needs. So what conclusions do I want you to draw from this? Across North America and Europe, we've accumulated a substantial, consistent library full of evidence across a range of outcomes that Housing First effectively increases time in accommodation, in homeless accommodation, increases time in private accommodation, and promotes recovery on a range of indicators. Homeless service users in Housing First programs experience more choice over housing and services and better housing quality, and these are key factors to promote individualized recovery from homelessness. And it costs less too. So what can you do? We have a plan for that. I encourage you to be a champion for Housing First policy implementation at local and national and international levels. The arguments for doing so are moral. It's the right thing to do, and housing is a human right. The arguments are fiscal. It costs less than treatment as usual, and it's evidence-based. Housing First ends homelessness, and it promotes recovery. We need to phase out traditional approaches to homeless services and replace them with Housing First programs. This can be done and has been done through reconfiguration of existing programs and implementation of new Housing First programs. But doing so rests on an adequate supply of affordable housing integrated into the community. We need to not only increase the availability of social housing, we need to be sure that people with long histories of homelessness gain access to housing with adequate rent controls and tenants' rights. housing first is the moral, fiscal, and pragmatic, evidence-based solution to ending chronic homelessness. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Greenwood. Next, Dr. Paul Thoreau, professor of psychology at Wayne State University, Detroit, is going to speak with us. He speaks from a body of 30 years of research on issues around homelessness, anything from population estimates to public opinion, to focus on adults, children, substance abuse, mental health, and even longitudinal studies across countries. Just a big body of research. He is also serves on the Research Council of the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and is very active with the Society for Community Research in Action, a division of the American Psychological Association, and was a recent past president. I might also note that I met Dr. Toro in Columbia, South Carolina a few years ago, and I was in grad school and already knew, I had done a second-year project on homelessness, and knew your work. It's really impressive to meet you again. Dr. Paul Thoreau.
Well, I'm glad to be here at the UN. I'm going to talk about one line of research that my research team has been engaging in for the past 20 years or so, and that is to look at the prevalence of homelessness across nations and to look at public opinion differences across nations. Why should we study the prevalence of homelessness across nations? Well, we want to understand what causes this problem. And many people have their own pet theories. When I speak to different groups of people or just friends at a party, I tell them that I do research on the homeless, and they say, well, gee, wow, why do we have homelessness in a rich nation like the U.S.? And then they go on to tell me their pet theory very often. Well, my view is we ought to bring data to bear here. We ought to find data that will help us understand what these causes are, and cross-cultural international research can help us do that. It can also help us learn about solutions. The people or nations where we have high rates of homelessness, like in the United States, can learn from nations where they have low rates of homelessness. I'm not going to get into details about the methodology, but there's three basic approaches if you want to find out how many homeless people are there. What usually comes to most people's minds is the first one, a census-style count. Let's go out tonight and in New York City and count all the homeless people. Send thousands of enumerators out there and do it. Well, that's the methodology that's become most popular, and it seems sensible, but it gives us horrible underestimates, and it's very costly to send out thousands of people just in one city. If you had to do it in every city, it's very costly. The next method is using service utilization systems, which now exist in most American cities. We have management information systems for counting homeless people as they enter emergency shelters and other services for homeless people. And over a period of time, over say a year's time, we can tell you how many people were homeless in the past year, or in the past 3 years, the past 5 years. Finally, we have a method that I'm going to use, large-scale household surveys. We call random samples of people, just like all the political polls that are now gearing up in our country right now. We use those same kind of methods. Now, the first two methods I mentioned give us underestimates, but so too do we get underestimates from the household survey method. We should remember that. The currently homeless often don't have cell phones, though increasingly young people who are homeless do. It's a new phenomenon. We might be able to do surveys of currently homeless people by cell phones. We get the highest rates through the telephone survey for a couple of reasons. One is we include not only the obviously homeless who are staying in a shelter, or they're sleeping in their car because they have nowhere else to live, they're sleeping in the park, etc., but we also get people more marginally homeless who are just homeless for a couple of days, they're sleeping out in the park, that kind of thing. We also get high estimates because we're estimating lifetime prevalence. The other estimates don't allow us to do that. Have you ever been homeless in your lifetime? And maybe what's your estimate of becoming homelessness in the future? First studies were done in the US. Let's skip over this. Let's go through this quickly. The first study completed by my group included 10 nations, interviewed over a long period of time. 8 of these nations were in Europe, 2 of them North America, so the United States and Canada. We end up with lifetime prevalence of literal homelessness in this study, and in the next one I'm going to describe to you. What I mean by literal homelessness these are people who are staying in shelters for homeless people. They're sleeping outside, they're sleeping along 42nd Street that you just saw. These people are literally homeless, as opposed to people we might say are precariously housed or unstably housed, which are a lot more people, but in this study we're focusing on the literal homeless. There's a second study done as part of the Home EU project that Ronnie mentioned that surveyed 8 nations in Europe. 4 of these 8 nations were also included in my study. And I'm going to present data from the 2 studies together here in this slide. Ireland was cut off its low. These estimates from the Marseille group study and from our study are arrayed from high to low. So we have Spain as the clear winner here at 12.6%, very high, much higher than any of the others. Even the next highest one, the United Kingdom, we're talking 4% more than that one. And these are lifetime prevalence, again, of literal homeless from telephone surveys, random samples of national people. So we've got Spain, then we've got a group of 5 nations that are also high, but not so high as Spain. We got UK, Canada, Belgium, Sweden, and US, all with nations with 6% or more prevalence lifetime. Then we have a group of 4 more, Netherlands, Poland, Italy, Portugal, that have rates around 3 or 4%, moderate rates of lifetime homelessness. And then finally we have 4 losers at the bottom, Czech Republic, Germany, France, and Ireland, with rates around 2%. So there's variation here, and it's quite extreme, from 2% to over 12%. So just among developed countries, wide range. I'm going to skip over these to save some time and summarize, first of all, public opinion, then I'm going to come back to those prevalence rates. I ask you to think about, by the way, those rates, assuming they're true and accurate, why? What explains that variation in rates across countries? Think about it for a few minutes. I'm going to come back. But first, let me say just a little bit about public opinion and how it connects with prevalence. In our study, where we have very detailed data on public opinion, we see the 3 nations, the highest in our study, US, UK, and Canada, also show different kinds of attitudes about homeless people. They show less sympathy for homeless people across a variety of items. They see homelessness as not so much due to economic factors, but more due to the people's own personal failings. And they also see high rates of mental illness and substance abuse among homeless people. We can come back and talk about that more if you want, but now let's go back to those prevalence data. For me, there's a few things that when you look at that array of numbers, that kind of jump out at me. One of them is the so-called Gini index. The Gini index tells you how much the wealth of the country is concentrated in a small number of hands. So when the Gini is 100, that's the highest possible score, that means there's a king who owns everything, gets all the income, nobody else gets anything. That's 100. At the other end, you have a Gini of 0, which means everybody has exactly the same income. Completely egalitarian society, no variation in the income that people get. Well, among those nations that you saw earlier, I can skim back to it now. You've got US is traditionally the highest. So high rate of homelessness, but very high Gini index. But Spain is number 2 on that list. And United Kingdom and Canada are pretty high. Very low in the Gini index, we've got France, Germany, Czech Republic. They're quite low on the Gini index among these developed nations. So this is one thing. We could talk more about why in the question and answer time if you wish. But there's something about this concentration of wealth that leads to more homelessness. Another thing that jumps out for me is the quality of social services and health services in a country. France and Germany have a world-renowned, wonderful system of healthcare and social services. And they're big countries. They're not small countries. You can argue with a small country, well, it's easy for them. But these are big countries. On the other hand, Spain, United Kingdom, Canada, US, not such good healthcare and social service systems there. And I ask you to think of other possibilities to explain this variation in rates. And we could talk about it later. But now let's jump ahead to some other summaries here. One last summary. So I mentioned that there's wide variability in the rates of homelessness. But there's also wide variability in policies. Ronnie mentioned the situation in Finland, which I would like to mention again. In Finland, they made a kind of national commitment to get rid of homelessness a decade or two ago. They didn't like what they were seeing, and they put a lot of funds into it, and basically made it a guarantee of housing for all citizens in Finland. And they made a huge dent. There's very few people homeless now in Finland as a result. We can all learn from Finland, I think. Policy matters, and policy can make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Toro. Before I introduce our last speaker, I will note that it takes a village to raise a child, and it takes a team to put on an event like this, but it takes an individual to be willing to commit to initiate those phone calls and do all of the worrying that is required for one of these side events. And I want to thank Debbie Ragin so much for everything you've done. It's been, I don't know what you will do with your time after this afternoon.
I don't know either.
Yeah, okay. Welcome aboard. She's just been on the team for a few months.
Thank you.
You're glad to have. And our last speaker is Deputy Commissioner Sapna Ra from the City of New York, from the Law Enforcement Bureau of the Commission of Human Rights. Your entity has 45 attorneys. It's actually hard to believe. 45 attorneys investigating claims of discrimination in New York City towards the homeless. Prior to this fantastic responsibility, she was with the Fair Housing Organization, part of Legal Services in Memphis, Tennessee. Also formerly with the Assistant U.S. Attorney's Civil Division Office, Southern District of New York. Ms. Raj has a JD from Fordham and an MS from NYU, and I'm thrilled, we're really thrilled to have you. Thank you for coming uptown for this event.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the New York City Human Rights Law, which actually protects all of us in New York City, whether we live here, we work here, or we are just visiting here. So this law actually is pretty broad. It's one of the broadest civil rights / human rights laws in the world, not just the country. And we're very proud of it. The 45 attorneys that we have working in our law enforcement bureau don't work just on homelessness. We work on all the areas of law that are covered by all areas of protection that are covered by our law. So I'm going to talk a little bit about it. The law prohibits discrimination in several areas. So in employment, which I'm not going to talk about today, public accommodations, which is almost anything that you can think of, restaurants, hotels, schools, gyms, everything is covered under public accommodations. Housing, which is what I'm going to talk about today. Discriminatory harassment, which is almost the equivalent of a hate crime law in the civil area rather than the criminal area. And then I'm going to also talk a little bit about the bias-based profiling provision of our law, which actually has a provision about homelessness. And I'll talk a little bit about one of our cases that we have, which I think is quite interesting when, in light of what everybody else on this panel has spoken about. Okay? Under our law, the last incident of discrimination must have occurred within the last year, but you have up to 3 years to file in court if you're not filing with us as the commission. So, what is discrimination? And most of us have a real problem, whether we are attorneys or not, in deciding what is discrimination, because we think that if someone doesn't treat us well, that's somehow discrimination. And people actually have a right not to treat each other well, and not like each other, but you cannot like or not treat each other well because you belong to a protected class. So you have to have a nexus between the two. So we get people all the time who come in and say, that person, my employer, my landlord, or someone I went to, when I went to the gym, that person treated me badly. That can be either a First Amendment issue, or it can be just that they just don't like you. But if they don't like you because of your protection, because you belong to a protected class, and we have 27 different protected classes under the New York City Human Rights Law, which is pretty broad, then it's a problem, right? So if it's unfair or unequal treatment of a person or a group based on certain characteristics of membership in a protected class, right? And it's multidimensional, so it can be overt or subtle. Most of us know that discrimination, when we think of discrimination, we mostly think of race, but there's so much more to discrimination than just race. And I'll show you the different classes for protections that there are. Just in housing, you have age, alienage, or citizenship status. And all of this is not just because you belong to the protected class, but you may be perceived to be part of that protected class. So if the other person thinks that you belong to that protected class and treats you or discriminates against you, then that is a cause of action under our law. Because you have children. So, someone says to you, I'm not going to rent to you because you have children, that's protected under our law. Color, disability, gender identity, lawful source of income is what I'm going to be talking about most. Lawful occupation, marital or partnership status, national origin, sexual orientation, status as a victim of domestic violence, pregnancy, race, religion, or creed, and uniform service. So quite a lot of protections just in housing. There are more in employment and slightly less in public accommodations. Okay? So I'll talk a little bit about lawful source of income, because this is where we come in touch with most folks who are either homeless, about to be homeless, or have been homeless. The landlords who say, or real estate agents, it doesn't have to be just the landlords, it can be real estate brokers, who say we don't accept vouchers. That's an overt form of discrimination, but there are so many other ways in which people who may have vouchers, and the City of New York actually has vouchers for people who are in shelters, so that's the City FEPS program. And there are some vouchers that are for folks who are coming out of DV shelters. So it can be, you may have a voucher, and the landlord won't let you in, even though that rent is something that you may be able to afford. And actually what we found in working with certain other organizations, we had overlaps of neighborhoods within New York City. And there were New York City neighborhoods where people with vouchers should have been able to find housing, safe, affordable housing, where there are good public schools and good transportation. But when you look at the number of vouchers in those neighborhoods, there are very, very few vouchers. It's because the landlords and the real estate brokers were keeping people with vouchers out of those neighborhoods, even though the rent was actually affordable for folks with vouchers. So that's the more discrete way of discriminating against people with vouchers. So in New York City, a landlord or a broker with the right to rent, sell, lease, or at least one building has to have 6 or more units for this source of income law to apply. The state law has recently been changed where it doesn't matter how many units you have. You cannot discriminate against someone on the basis of the fact that they have a voucher. So even if you have just 1 unit, you're not going to be able to discriminate on the basis of state law. But this is, the city law still says 6 or more units. The person has to have 6 or more units. The landlord has to have. Okay? So people who refuse to rent an apartment because the tenant has a voucher, including Section 8. So Section 8 is the voucher program that comes from the federal government, and it's something that landlords cannot say they are not sure they're going to receive, because they almost always receive that money. Even if they say the city programs sometimes, have had issues in the past, the federal program, they can't say that. And what happens when someone has a voucher, the apartment rents for $1,500, the person has a voucher for $1,600, and they still will not rent to that person. Or they ask for different other things. So they ask for things like, how much money do you earn? So the person may not have employment income. And they want the person to show that they have 40 times the rent in income. Why would that be important when you have a voucher that totally covers your rent, right? So, there are ads in the paper, on Craigslist, on, lots of places that you see ads for apartments, which will say no vouchers. You can't have a separate list for people who have vouchers. You can't say, well, that landlord has a list for people with vouchers and people with income, and so I'll put you on the list for people with vouchers. You're not allowed to do that under our law. Okay? So I'm just going to talk a little bit about cases in litigation now. I just talked about, we have several cases where the large landlords were requiring a certain amount of income before the person would get an apartment. And our position is, under our law, if you do that, you may be having a rule that applies to everyone equally, but it has a disparate impact on a certain group. So the law is applied to everybody. I mean, the landlord says, I apply this rule to everyone. Everyone who comes in has to have 40 times the rent. But that rule has a different effect on someone who has a voucher, and that voucher can pay for the apartment, right? I will talk a little bit about commission-initiated investigations. So it's not only when someone comes to us with an issue, we as the commission can initiate an investigation and investigate landlords or real estate brokers or whoever else is causing a problem for people with vouchers or who are homeless and are trying to find housing. We use testers, which means that we have a testing program. Under the civil rights law, nationally, testers are used. So you can have people posing as if they're trying to find housing. And then if the landlord or the real estate broker says that they will not rent to them or says something discriminatory, then we can bring an action, legal action against them on that basis. So we have testers who go in and pretend on the phone that they are trying to rent an apartment. Or you may have 2 testers, we call that PED testing. One tester goes in saying that they have regular income, employment income, and the other person goes in saying that they have a voucher. And you see how the 2 people are treated differently. Okay? So we use testers for that. Ghosting cases are where you call the person, you call a landlord or a real estate agent, they say they have an apartment, you've seen the ad for it, and they're quite willing to show it to you until they learn that you have a voucher. Once you tell them that you have a voucher, you never hear from them again, no matter how many times you text them or email them or call them. And so that's ghosting cases. Okay? And I'll talk very quickly about bias-based profiling by law enforcement. So that is a provision of our law that says law enforcement cannot treat people differently just because they belong to a protected class. And one of the protections we have in that specifically is about homeless people. So we have a case that's pending before us that came, I'm not talking about something, I usually don't talk about open investigations, but this has been in the news, so everyone's gone out and talked about it, all parties. But a homeless organization brought a case before us saying that the police in New York City were asking people who are homeless to move along. They were called move along orders. So if they saw people either just congregating 2 or 3 people in a specific place or just one person, they had the right to come in and just say, move along, just get away from here, we don't want you here. And what we, under this law, what we're investigating is, are they allowed to actually do that when the person who, or the people who are there are not necessarily doing anything that's unlawful? Would the people be asked to move along if they were not homeless, or not perceived to be homeless? So that's what this law actually addresses, and it's still in the process of being negotiated. So we'll see where it goes with that. So the commission can impose $125,000 in civil penalties for violations. That means that it's a fine to the city. It doesn't come to the commission. And that's for each violation. And up to $250,000. So it's a max of $250 per violation. And of course, the people who are, who are being discriminated against can get money in damages and emotional suffering. Whatever whatever we deem that amount should be. Usually our cases are settled. Thank you.
So we're going to open the floor to questions and answers, but we're going to recognize one of our two interns, Miss Priya, and I'm not going to try your last name, but I'll just try it, excuse me, who is serving as our discussant. Priya, and I'll take the time now to just thank our interns, both Priya and Maya, who is operating our live stream here. I want to thank them very much for the work that they're doing here. So Priya, if you will get us started on the discussion.
Sure. So thank you so much for all the talk. I know it's a very limited time given to you, but you have managed very well to share some of your incredible work. You brought a very huge global perspective and narrow it down to what's ongoing here in the city, and just I'm pretty sure everybody here is going away with valuable information on this issue. So I'm going to just give a few lines about what your presentation, and I'm going to pose a question, and then I can move on to our audience to ask if they have any questions to you. So starting with Dr. Deborah Padgett. So she started off with housing first from a global perspective. She mentioned some of the factors that influence prioritizing housing first, and also discussed some of the major challenges that make this reality happening. And her shift towards the global south, where the affordable housing is limited, housing first work with the Banyan organizations provides an inclusive option for homeless women with serious mental illness. So my question to you, continuing on this particular work with the global south, just working with the homeless population itself is very challenging. And especially in the global south, there's a whole lot of stigma about mental illness. So what kind of some of the challenges that you face when there's an intersection of homelessness with mental illness, with your experience working with the Banyan organization, and how do they overcome these challenges?
Oh, that's a long question. I'll try to answer it quickly. Well, the ethnographic work that I have done with a colleague, Hindi-speaking colleague, was in Delhi with pavement dwellers, people who were homeless. And among those individuals, we didn't find much evidence of serious mental illness, just severe poverty. These were families. So the Banyan has chosen to focus on women with severe mental illness. And I think, particularly women in this case, I think it's a good priority to make, because women in India without family support are put at much higher risk. But I think the conditions in Chennai are similar in many parts of the global south, that there are sometimes local governments that are more promising in providing support to the NGO. I don't think NGOs can do it all, and I do think governments need to be involved, and I think that's one of the issues that I find the most difficult to encounter, is how to get more buy-in from the government itself, and not just expect volunteers and others to do the work. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Next is Dr. Ronnie Greenwood, and she emphasized on ending chronic homelessness, and she shared some of the major findings from her research, and she compared the traditional approach of homeless services, where an individual has to go through several steps to acquire permanent housing, to her person-centered homes, which provides immediate access to private homes. And we saw a lot of evidence-based with regard to person-centered approach. But I'm curious to know what are some of the barriers in the transition from traditional housing to moving towards the person-centered approach? What is kind of holding that back off from moving forward?
The most significant barrier to moving toward a housing first approach is access to housing. So in order to deliver housing first, you need independent scattered site housing located, integrated into a community. There's several reasons for this. The most important of them are the decrease in stigma associated with being homeless is reduced or eliminated by being integrated into your community. By not living in congregate housing with people in differing levels of recovery, you can go along your own recovery journey to the fullest extent that you possibly can. It's very difficult to struggle with addiction and to reduce your own use when you're living with people in heavy use. There's lots of crime. People are poor, they have very little money, very little position, so there's crime, there's theft, there's violence. It's a terrible place to live. So the most important thing we need is access to housing, and that is the reason, and that is a challenge for political reasons. It's a challenge for public opinion reasons. So we have to convince critics that housing first is the way to go. Deborah talked about moral arguments against housing first, that you need to earn your housing, that why should you give someone for nothing? These people are undeserving. We've got to reduce that. You can either appeal to people through a moral argument that housing is a fundamental human right. That is where I prefer to put my emphasis. You can also hit them, in the pocketbook. It makes no sense to hold on to your, deservingness arguments if you're also a fiscal conservative. So the barriers really are in terms of we've got to break down barriers to access to housing. Once we have that, we can put a program in place that is highly effective. The problem is that we are increasingly in housing crises, and the supply of housing is getting smaller and not bigger. And the share of the pie that goes to the people who have been waiting and struggling in chronic homelessness is getting smaller and smaller.
Thank you. Then Dr. Toro presented his findings from 14 developed nations about the prevalence on homelessness. He briefly described the methodology of the estimation in the prevalence of homelessness, and also he further talked about the attitudes and general opinion among the public about homelessness and the significant relationship between that. And I know, you had a very limited time, and you were trying to talk about some of the interesting findings that you found in these nations, like Ireland, with a very lowest rate of literal homelessness. And I'm just would you like to elaborate on some of the interesting findings that you kind of learned from this nation that were success enough to kind of maintain a very low homelessness rate?
Yes, well, we need to speculate to some extent on what might be the causal factors. We can actually compute correlations, as I have with the Gini index. It correlates with those rates as I found them. But it's more just thinking about this. What could explain those rates? And people come up with different things. For one thing, people often mention is, well, the size of the country. A big nation has a bigger problem. Smaller nations have an easier time, but it doesn't fit. We've got the U.S., by far the biggest country. Has kind of a moderate to high level. The next biggest countries, we're talking about Germany and France, they have very low rates. Spain is big, but it has a very high rate. Canada's teeny. In terms of population, it's one of the smallest countries on this list, but it still has a high rate of homelessness. So that's one that doesn't fly, if you will. So it's really a matter of thinking. I actually thought this might be a good group to put forward these numbers and see what the audience thinks. What else can explain this? Again, buying that the rates might be accurate more or less, what other things could explain this array of things?
Thank you. Then we are moving on to Sapna Ra. She addressed the human/civil rights perspective of homelessness issue and how specifically the human rights laws stand against discrimination on these homelessness issues, based on this 27 protected class, and they have like specific provisions on the housing. And as someone coming from this field, what kind of policies you would like to see, like changes in these policies that you would like to see in order to make these laws to kind of implement much more effectively? And also, I assume a lot of here are mental health professionals, and we have like psychologists in the panel too. And what kind of inputs us can kind of bring into this policy making with regard to the specific issue?
So we have a different section of our agency that deals with policy. I don't necessarily deal with that. They deal with the law enforcement part. But I think the Housing First, I mean, I worked a little bit with veterans and Housing First in my previous job, and I think the Housing First model actually works because when you give people housing first and you look at the other issues they have after that, it seems to have a greater effect than trying to get people well, so to speak, quote unquote, first, and then put them in housing.
Thank you so much. So we can open up to our audience. If you have any questions for the speakers, you can.
I have two questions. The first question, I should first introduce myself, right? My name is Dr. Donna Akila. Okay, that's even better. Okay, because I don't have to use that teacher voice, that professor voice. All right. Good morning, I think. My name is Dr. Donna Akila Wright, and I'm actually the chair for what is the department called? The Department of Developmental and Special Education at Medgar Evers College, which is part of the City University system. I'm the early childhood specialist there, and I'm also a United Nations representative from Oecd, which is the World Organization for Early Childhood Education. So my question is, in terms of homeless, home first. In Brooklyn, you already know, there is a high rate of homelessness that we see, something we've never seen before. And I wanted to know who actually gets the Home First programs? I mean, what is the profile of that? And the other question I have to ask is really to the entire panel is, so what happens if a mother has more than one child? How does she fit into these programs? Or is it just that she has one child? Do you know what I'm saying, where I'm going with that? Okay, thank you so much.
I have to answer some of that, I'm sorry. Sorry. Currently, Housing First is not really present in New York City, nor in Los Angeles, the two cities with the largest increases in.
Are my eyes opened up large enough?
Yeah. And I'm working with some Human.NYC and some other very advocacy-oriented organizations, or with the City Council, trying to get Housing First back on track in New York City. But right now, because we have the legal right to shelter, that is off, which is a good thing at one level, but at another level, it has caused the city to spend almost all of its homeless funding on shelters. So we have families living in motels and paying private landlords. You know that whole story. And we have a session, by the way, today at 1:15 just on shelter.
I'm going to that one.
Yeah. Okay, second part of the question, I'm sorry,
was early childhood, and how does that, you know?
Yeah, we're going to discuss that at the 1:15 session, but
Okay,
I'll
so
turn that over to someone else.
I can talk about it just in terms of Housing First principles.
Yes.
So in terms of Housing First principle, and the target population of Housing First has tended to be, it started out with people coming out of psychiatric hospitals. People who have severe mental illness who were failed by deinstitutionalization. So the target population tended to be adult men with Axis I diagnoses. Women, of course, make up a smaller population of the chronically homeless smaller segment of the chronically homeless population. But women are engaged in Housing First. When we had a Housing First program, we had women with children in Housing First. Often the women who come into Housing First have lost their children, not lost, but their children are in care. And so one of the core goals and principles of Housing First is family reunification. And one of the reasons that scattered site housing is so important is that you can have your family over to your home. As your family grows and you're reunified, you can move into housing that fits your family's needs. If you're living in congregate housing, you can't have your child coming over there. You can't have guests. And so it's a really difficult way to foster reunification and reconnection. So it's another one of the key reasons that scattered site independent accommodation is fundamental to the all the recovery goals of individuals who experience homelessness.
Can I just say something? So I know the city has vouchers, like for example, the FEX voucher does not limit people to the number of children they have. So if you're coming out of a shelter, it's not the best solution, but it doesn't limit families to a certain number of children.
Thank you very much. I'm from Malawi, Africa. I have one question to ask. From the presentation, it shows that the home-based program is basically in Europe or Los Angeles and universities. But I haven't seen this kind of program in any African country. Is it by design?
I don't know of any housing first programs in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa or Northern Africa. There are programs for mental, like the Zimbabwe Friendship Bench has been widely used as a community-based program to address mental health issues, and I know housing unstable people are part of that group. But I'm not familiar with it occurring in Africa. And what I spoke about India was just almost happenstance that they happened to embrace that without knowing or saying it was housing first. But it just worked.
Thank you. My name is Maria Vargas Muniz. I come from Lisboa, Portugal. I'm within Psychology University Institute. And I worked with Ronni Greenwood and Paul Thoreau in the Home EU project. And now what we've seen here today is another wonderful example about how Housing First does work. And our question now is, how do we take this to a next level? As you were, Deborah was saying, I'm trying to negotiate this back to New York. I think we are here at the United Nations. We have a solution for long-term homelessness with people with severe and complex needs. We do have a solution. It works. It's cost-effective. We have everything right here, except the next level, which is to actually enforce municipalities into resolving, solution-focused, and not exactly always giving up to these extremely powerful lobbies for the homelessness industry. How can we reverse that and be more powerful? We have the science, we have everything except the power to implement. It's growing, but it's growing very slowly. We need faster. Thank you.
Just a quick note, that California is on the cusp of making this decision. Do we go with shelters? Do we go with Housing First? How can we just do some bridge shelters, but also keep our commitment to Housing First? And there's very lively debates in California. In New York, it is a shelter industry. It's a $3 billion industry. So it's going to take something massive in terms of political will to change the situation here. But I'm somewhat heartened in California that they've embraced Housing First. And now, in the phase of trying to have emergency shelters built, but also commit to affordable housing. Time will tell. I know we went.
But California put Housing First into law, and they have hardly any housing for it several years later.
Well, they're building, I know, but the thing of it, I've actually dug into this. Building codes, zoning regulations, we've lost construction workers because of the current presidential administration's restrictions on immigration. So construction worker costs have risen. It's amazing how this formula comes together and conspires against building in this country. It's going to take a lot of change in different ways. But I still have hope for California. They are opening more and more units.
So as I hear you still have an outstanding questions of how we're going to get this into New York. We also have to ask whether or not we can expand this model to other nations, countries in Africa and other places as well. So we have a lot more to digest and talk about. I hope I've given you some lunchtime conversations. And with that, I'll thank you all for being here. I thank our SPSSI members. I thank our distinguished panel. And thank you all for attending.